Good morning or good afternoon to everyone, and thank you so much for joining Pentaho today for this presentation on the Wisdom of Crowds Business Intelligence Market Study, presented to you today by Howard Dresner, the Chief Research Officer of Dresner Advisory Services. This presentation will discuss the key findings of his 2013 research. With that, let me go ahead and introduce our speaker for today and move into the main part of the webinar. Howard Dresner, as we've mentioned, is the Chief Research Officer for Dresner Advisory Services. He is one of the foremost thought leaders in business intelligence today. Howard has published 2 books on the subject that are both available from John Wiley & Sons. The first, The Performance Management Revolution, Business Results Through Insight and Action. And the second, Profiles in Performance, Business Intelligence Journeys and the Roadmap for Change. Howard lectures at forums around the globe and is often cited by the business and trade press. Prior to establishing Dresner Advisory Services, Howard served as Chief Strategy Officer at Hyperion Solutions and was also a research fellow at Gartner, where he led its business intelligence research practice for 13 years. Howard has conducted and directed numerous in-depth primary research studies over the course of the past 2 decades and is an expert in analyzing these markets. Through the Wisdom of Crowds Business Intelligence Market Research Reports, Howard engages with a global community to redefine how research is created and shared. Landmark research reports include many Wisdom of Crowds studies around business intelligence, collaborative business intelligence, cloud business intelligence, and mobile business intelligence. And as we've said, today we are more than happy to welcome Howard to share with you the key findings from the Wisdom of Crowds Business Intelligence Market Study for 2013. With that, I'll turn it over to Howard, and thank you, Howard, for joining us.
Thanks, Terry, and thanks for that great introduction. And welcome, everybody. We appreciate you carving out some time from your busy schedules to join us today. At the outset, let me just share with you a little bit about this particular study. This is the 4th annual edition of our Wisdom of Crowds Business Intelligence Market Study. And the reason we call it Wisdom of Crowds is because we do a good measure of crowdsourcing as a component of data collection. So we try to be as inclusive as possible, and we thought that that crowdsourcing component of what we do is so important that we actually registered the trademark Wisdom of Crowds as our brand for Dresner Advisory Services. So this is our flagship study. I'll talk about some of the other things we're doing this year as part of the research agenda as well. But as part of this, we actually examine a broad range of issues related to business intelligence. We expand it every year, which is kind of challenging. So we try to address the things that are new and emerging in the marketplace, things that are becoming more important year over year. And this year was certainly no exception. So we added a lot of user trending this year, which will cover some of this. Of course, what's in this presentation is not the totality of the study. The study was over 100 pages in length, and the entire study is actually available on Pentaho's website. So if you're interested in receiving or downloading the entire study, go to Pentaho's website and fill out their form, and you can receive that information for your own purposes. So we always have to put this disclaimer slide up, and our legal counsel insists upon it. But basically, the net here is, aside from the fact that we own all the content, we always encourage organizations when they're selecting technology and services to use multiple sources. In other words, to be as informed as you possibly can be before you make a choice. And ours is, we believe, one of those important sources that you ought to engage with. So I talked about a little bit about some of the other things we're doing. The flagship study that we're going to talk about today is the Wisdom of Crowds BI Market Study, and the Buyer's Guide edition of that came out in June of this year. And each one of these actually has its own clever URL, so if you want to license these online, you certainly can. We also just published our 2nd annual Cloud Business Intelligence Market Study in July, and last week we released our inaugural Embedded Business Intelligence Market Study. The next one's coming out will be our Collaborative BI Market Study, the second one, and then we'll be publishing our 5th annual Mobile Computing and Mobile BI Market Study in November. So we're pretty busy. So let's get into the actual meat of the presentation, starting with demographics. And it's important to have an understanding of where this information comes from, the source of it, so it gives you a sense of how broad a reach we have. Let me go back there for a moment. So in terms of geography, we've been able to attract lots of respondents from a fairly wide number of geographies, 25% from EMEA, 35 countries, 11% from APAC, 15 countries there. And North America, of course, is always the largest. We try to compensate for that as much as we can and get other geographies involved. But it's important to note that even though it's 59%, it represents 43 U.S. states, the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, and also 5 Canadian provinces. In terms of the functions that we attracted, this year we approached things a little bit differently, too. It should be noted that we broke out the BI Competency Center as its own function. Now, sometimes that Competency Center does report into IT, sometimes it reports into finance. And the reason we broke it out is because it's a real bona fide buying center. And when I was at Gartner, it was over 10 years ago, we started writing research about this thing called the BI Competency Center, even though there weren't that many of them out there. Well, these days there are quite a few BI Competency Centers. You may, in fact, have one in your own organization. And they do, in fact, do some pretty good work in many organizations and do, in fact, buy products and services. So IT makes up about 36%. Executive management, we do get a lot of execs that weigh in. And then, approximately 6% finance, and then operations, marketing, sales, and so forth. And then vertical industries, now you notice that technology is 15%, but we also have consulting in there. You might be thinking, well, why do we have consulting in there? We actually invite consultants into the process, and that's simply because consultants have a unique perspective on the marketplace. They tend to know the vendors and the products better than their customers, and oftentimes they are familiar with multiple vendors and products, and it also gives us a sense of the size of the consulting ecosystem associated with any particular vendor. So we actually like when consultants come in. Of course, vendors are not welcome to come in, not a surprise there, and we do have a multi-phase data quality and vetting process to make sure that these folks are real bona fide business intelligence technology users. Other vertical industries, typical ones you would expect, financial services, healthcare, manufacturing, and so forth, relatively stable year over year, little shifting, but typically those are the big ones. In terms of sizes of organizations, we have a nice distribution. If we were to bucket the ones in the middle and call that mid-market, a good number of very small organizations, a great mid-market sample, if you will, and then a fairly stable large organization sample. And actually the smallest of organizations declined a little bit year over year in favor of some of these mid-sized organizations. And there's a lot of activity in mid-market, so we're kind of interested to see that. And one of the things that we do find just about with every study over the last, X number of years is that there's a lot of contrast based on the size of organization, much more so than vertical industry or some of the other demographics that we talked about, such as geography. A lot more consistency there, but size of organization, and you'll see this in some of the subsequent slides, there are some big differences based on whether you're in a small, mid-size, or large organization. So let's get on with it now that you understand who's in the actual sample and who participated in this. Now we'll go on to talk about some of the user trends. And as I mentioned earlier, we asked a lot of new questions this year, and there's some pretty cool stuff. And, of course, it'll be even more interesting next year when we have extra data to compare year over year. But where we could compare year over year, we did, in fact, do so because we've been collecting much of this data since 2010. So here's one of the new questions that we asked. Who's actually driving business intelligence within the organization? What do I mean by driving it? Whose idea is it? Who's actually motivated? Who's funding this within the organization and trying to move things forward? And interestingly enough, the number one answer is executive management. And we find that time and time again. The number two answer is finance. And then it goes down, operations, strategic planning. IT is, close. They're close. They're, pretty much even with strategic planning and with sales. And then it trails down, marketing less. So what's interesting, we see the BI Competency Center, they're not they're not a function that drives business intelligence. And maybe they should, and maybe in some organizations they do drive business intelligence, but they tend to act more as a service organization. So when there is a requirement for business intelligence, then they get engaged. They're not the ones that actually drive it. Let's move on and talk about this by organization size. And here's, as I mentioned earlier, right, we see a lot of really interesting contrast when you look at it by organization size. So it's fairly consistent whether you look at this by size of organization, geography, vertical. Executive management is pretty much always in the driver's seat. So the C-levels, or maybe the level just below them, tend to be the ones that drive the initiative within their organization for business intelligence. But it's these other ones, and I was going to exclude executive management, but I thought it was important to leave it in there just for the context. You can see as you go from the smallest organizations to the largest organizations, things change. And for instance, if you look at that orange bar, the one on the far right of each grouping here, you see that sales in small organizations plays a really prominent role, as does marketing. So as we go to the right, we actually see sales and marketing playing somewhat of a diminished role, especially in that next bucket to the right. And you start to see things like IT playing a much more significant role, and the competency center. So as we go from left to right, it becomes less business-driven, and it becomes more operationally oriented, more technologically oriented, with the very largest of organizations. Next, let's take a look at targeted business users. So this is different than who's driving it. This is who's going to consume it. And what's interesting to note, and perhaps not a surprise to many of you, the drivers also tend to be the most direct beneficiaries of business intelligence. So senior management typically are the ones that are the primary target, regardless of who the actual drivers are. It could be finance driving it, and they're targeting their most senior level executives for business intelligence capabilities. So not really surprising. As you go to the right, you can see it trails off. So then you have middle management. So it sort of follows the hierarchy of the organization, right? Executives, middle managers, line managers, individual contributors and professionals, and then, customers are a little bit lower, and then suppliers. Well, suppliers are really low, actually. And I love to see when organizations really automate their customers. And in certain industries, they actually do that, surprisingly. For instance, if you were to look at, I don't have a slide on this, but if you were going to look at the insurance industry, for instance, you would see that customer bar be much higher, much more of the blue as a primary target than perhaps in other organizations. So the next thing we asked about this year, which is new, and you would think, why didn't you ask this in previous years? And the answer is, I don't know. It's a really good question. I wish we had asked it last year. But what are their objectives for business intelligence within their organization? What do they hope to achieve? And there are two scales here. So you see the percentages, whether it was critical, very important, and so forth, on the left. And then we have a weighted mean on the right. So that's a separate scale going from 0 to 5, just to give you some perspective. But better decision-making seems to be the chief answer for what they hope to do. And it's kind of hard to measure that, right? But, everybody wants to make better decisions. Who wants to make bad decisions, right? Nobody does. So better decision-making is at the top of the list. But we're actually encouraged to see things like the next to the right, the next bar, improved operational efficiency. Okay, well, I can measure that. Or growth in revenues. I can measure that. I really like those two in many ways better than the others. Even increased competitive advantage and enhanced customer service are much more measurable. But everybody sort of, it reminds me of, there was a vendor years ago that said they're no longer around, saying their campaign was making better decisions every day. And that's, I guess they tapped into that sentiment way back then. So better decision making. If we take a look, and once again, this is where you start to see the differences by size of organization. When we cross-tab better, this notion of objectives for business intelligence with the size of organization, it definitely changes. And you can see, of course, still, once again, everybody wants to make better decisions. Doesn't matter of the size of the organization. But within smaller organizations, you can see that there's more of an emphasis upon what I call more of the strategic bent. growth in revenues, increased competitive advantage, and then, yes, of course, operational efficiency and enhanced customer service. And as we go to the right, sure enough, we can see that some of the things like growth in revenue go down a bit, and then we can see operational efficiency goes up rather substantially, actually, as well as enhanced customer service. So the way that organizations expect to use and the benefits they expect to derive from business intelligence definitely changes based on the size of the organization. And so if we take a look at it by function, now you can see the differences are a little bit more slight here, but there are actually some differences. So, for instance, if you see executive management and sales and marketing, there's more of an emphasis on things like growth in revenues and competitive advantage. And if you take a look at sort of what I would consider back office type functions, so finance and IT and strategic planning too, by the way, are much more focused on operational efficiency. And the interesting one here that sort of sticks out is human resources. They're talking about enhanced customer service as the highest priority of all the functions. I'm not sure if they mean their internal customer, because we didn't ask that, or whether they mean the external customer. But it is interesting to note that when you look at the business functions, it's more of a strategic focus. If you look at the back office functions, more operational in nature, and that really doesn't come as much of a surprise. Let's change gears for just a moment and take a look at penetration. And interestingly enough, for years since we started this particular study, we always asked about the usage of specific tools and the penetration of specific tools, but we did not ask about the penetration of all business intelligence tools, and organizations use more than one very often. So this year we did, and what we found is penetration is still relatively low. It's not nearly as high. I mean, when I was at Gartner, I started talking about something called information democracy, and the idea there would be access to these insights through business intelligence available to everybody, because we believe that everyone within an enterprise and even beyond the enterprise, all stakeholders have a need for insight to inform their own roles and their own decision making. And I'm here to tell you that we're not there yet. So the good news is there's lots of opportunity. The bad news is there's a lot of work to be done. So only a minority of employees in most organizations even have access to business intelligence capabilities today. However, these organizations have some pretty heady plans, and it's pretty ambitious. If you look at the bar charts here, if you look at where they think they're going to be in 12 months, you don't see a lot of the blue, right? So the blue is under 10% penetration. You see a lot of red, a lot of green, and as you go to the right, you see more of the orange, which is 81% or more penetration. Wow, that's very impressive, and I'm here to tell you they're not going to get there, especially when you look at 24 and 36 months out. That's way out into the future. They're simply just not going to achieve what they think they're going to achieve. 12 months, well, chances are in 12 months there may be projects which are actually budgeted for. There are plans for them. So it's entirely possible they'll achieve a good measure of that, but once again, it's unlikely they'll achieve all of that. So the good news is, even though we have limited penetration today, which, by the way, is much better than it was 5 or 10 years ago, but even though it's somewhat limited, the plans that organizations are making are pretty ambitious. They certainly have an intent to expand usage pretty broadly within the organizations, even in the next 12 months. That's pretty encouraging. If we take a look at penetration by geography, and I like to put this one up there just to confirm what we thought we already knew. It's like, okay, well, look, North America is in the lead, has most of the organizations or many of the organizations with pretty deep penetration of usage. So that's not surprising. North America, we tend to be the early adopters of technology. EMEA is pretty close on our heels. And then, APAC and Latin America follow thereafter. So, some of these slides, and some of these analyses surprise us. You look at them, you're like, wow, I didn't know that was going on in the marketplace. And some of them, like this one, confirms pretty much what we thought we already knew. And this slide does as well. When you look at penetration by selected industries, financial services at the top with the deepest penetration because they've been doing it for a really long time. We didn't have if we had a really large packaged goods sample, you'd see packaged goods up there as well. But financial services have, really been huge investors in business intelligence for as long as I've been covering this marketplace, which is 25 years now. And so not a surprise they have deepest penetration, followed by retail and wholesale. Healthcare is catching up, interestingly enough, followed by education and manufacturing. Now, if we look at intent, what are these guys going to do moving forward into the future? We see something a little bit different. So I'm going to go back for just a moment. Look at all the blue here. Blue says less than 10% penetration in those particular verticals. And then let's take a look at the next slide. And look, all the blue is almost gone. Wow. That's probably not going to happen next year, right, because this is 2014. But financial services hit a bump in the road, as you know, a couple of years ago, and this suggests that they're starting to invest again. So they were on hiatus as they went through some of their own difficulties, shall we say. But healthcare is number two. So healthcare was not number two in terms of their current penetration. They were really number three on our list. But here they're number two, so it says lots of investment in healthcare. We're starting to see that too, by the way, significant investment. And, education, number three. Education was at the bottom of our list of penetration. Retail is, is actually lower because they've already made significant investments. So it's sort of interesting to see who has deep penetration today and who's planning to make investments over the course of the next year. It's not always the same. And then by organization size, and we're going to see this time and again, right? You find that the smallest of organizations and the largest of organizations tend to make the greatest investments. And the smallest of organizations, they have the most penetration simply because they're small and it's less complex. The chain of command is much more efficient, fewer people to actually automate. So the small organizations use things like business intelligence as a real competitive differentiator. It actually enhances their agility because small companies, if they're not agile, simply couldn't compete in the marketplace. And then as you get to sort of mid-sized organizations, it's a little bit more mixed. And then you get to the largest organizations and you see it pick up again in terms of penetration simply because they have more resources. So within the smallest of organizations, you have that agility and it's just ease of implementation because it's simply less complex. In the largest organizations, you have more resources to throw at this and to invest. And mid-market sometimes gets stuck a little bit simply because they don't have the agility, certainly, but they also don't have the resources they can throw at this. Now, having said that, so if you look at these numbers, look at that blue again, that's very limited penetration. And then let's take a look at plans by organization size. And you can see that these mid-market folks have some pretty aggressive plans to deploy business intelligence within their organization. So once again, next year we'll ask the same questions again, and we'll see whether or not they actually achieved it. But certainly, once again, there's very strong intent, and the largest of organizations and the smallest aren't letting up either. They're clearly going to continue to invest. So once again, changing gears, let's talk about success with business intelligence and whether or not organizations perceive themselves to be successful with BI. And we asked this question last year, too. And so we have last year's data and this year's data. And basically, we posed the question, agree or disagree with the following question: have you been successful with business intelligence? And you can see the lion's share say that they've either been completely successful or somewhat successful. Of course, the completely successful is right around 40%, which means 60% or somewhat less than that. So once again, certainly room for improvement in terms of success. And we also asked them why. Why have they been successful or unsuccessful? And so we have word clouds. So those of you that like word clouds, I hope you enjoy this. They're kind of fun. I mean, it's sort of like a Rorschach chart. You can say almost anything to it for your own interpretation. But why are organizations successful with business intelligence? More often than not, it really doesn't come down to technology as it does to culture. Culture is a big deal here. But you can see that, data, so from a positive perspective, having all the data, having good data quality, having good data fluency. Do people understand the meaning of the data, know how to use it? An emphasis on business intelligence. The B in business intelligence is business. It has to be focused on the business. And really what it requires is a commitment from senior management. Senior management has to be involved. They have to view it as strategic. You need a stable organization and focus on critical opportunities. And then, of course, you need the requisite skills to be successful. So organizations that have been successful have cited all of these reasons for it. Now, why have they not been successful? It's interesting to note that data is prominent again. This is when data is incomplete or the data quality is poor, or you find that the users and the business really don't understand how to use the data. A lack of management commitment or understanding or an appreciation of value associated with business intelligence is often cited as the reason that they haven't been successful. A real focus on the technology versus solving business problems very often is one of the other things that is cited. And then, of course, lack of skills. So there are a lot of reasons. And there's more detail, of course, in the report if you have a chance to take a look and read it. So once again, let's move on. And I did want to share this interesting crosstab. And the reason that I created this, it's sort of an obvious one. So we took a look at sort of the next 12-month deployment plans by success with business intelligence. So if they've been successful or unsuccessful, what are their plans? You look at this, you say, well, that's pretty obvious, right? If they have been successful with business intelligence, of course they're going to deploy more of it over the next 12 months. That's true, but I think the point here is that if those initial implementations are very successful, they're much more likely to deploy or to more fully deploy business intelligence in the future. So the message here for all of the stakeholders is let's figure out whether it's the industry itself, whether it's the consulting organizations, whether it's an internal competency center or IT, we've got to strive to make those early implementations super successful if we want to see the broadest of deployments, which ultimately benefits the organization. Real quick, numbers of tools. There are lots of tools out there for business intelligence, lots of redundant tools. Some organizations have so many, they don't even know how many they have. 2 seems to be the most common number of tools out there. And we've seen year over year a change. So there are fewer organizations that say they have a single tool, and more organizations saying either they don't know or they have 2 or 4 or more tools. And multiple tools is not necessarily a problem per se, but things like common semantics and metadata, that could be a problem. So if we have multiple tools that are implemented in different ways, that could be a problem. So we do need a degree of governance if we're going to have a multi-tool strategy. So we also did a crosstab using success again with business intelligence and the number of tools. And what we found, once again, not a surprise, that if you have fewer tools, you're much more likely to be successful with business intelligence. This has nothing to do with the tools per se. What this has to do with is strategic deployment. So typically when you have fewer tools, it's because the most senior levels within an organization have approached business intelligence as something that is critical to their success and the success of the organization, and therefore they're a little bit more deliberate with their implementation of business intelligence. So that's why you see fewer tools correlated with success with business intelligence. Moving on, related technologies and initiatives strategic to BI, and we asked about 19 different areas. And not a surprise, dashboard or dashboarding and self-service, advanced visualization, and data warehousing are the top ones. And I'm going to dig into this in a little bit in just a moment. Like I said, we asked about 19 different areas, so there's a lot of stuff in here. Let me just take a look, or let you take a look at what's changed year over year. What's at the top in terms of improvement, even though it's relatively nascent, is cloud business intelligence. And as I mentioned earlier, we just published our Cloud BI report. What's notable there is we thought that cloud was going to be relatively flat year over year, and it wasn't. It actually increased year over year. Dashboards up also. Mobile support also up. Everything else was down either slightly or fairly significantly year over year in terms of its importance to organizations. And then I just want to present 2 slides to you talking about technology priorities, once again based on size of organization, because that's where we found a lot of contrast. So here, if you take a look at the technology priorities of small organizations, at the top of the heap, mobile. Man, they love mobile. And I would say that smaller organizations have really driven the whole mobile business intelligence phenomenon in the industry, more so than their larger counterparts. I mean, everybody's playing some role there. Certainly, smallest of organizations more so than larger. Cloud computing, hands down, driven by smaller organizations because it helps them really level the playing field when they can get solutions that can be easily purchased, more easily deployed, where they can purchase these things using operating funds as opposed to a capital expenditure. It's a huge benefit to them. So they're driving things like cloud. And also social media analysis tends to be or resonate more so with smaller organizations than large. When you take a look at larger organizations, data warehousing, they're much more interested in data warehousing, much more interested in advanced analysis and predictive analytics and the like. Collaborative is an interesting one. So it's sort of split between large and small, more interesting for large organizations. But when large organizations think about collaborative support, they're thinking about internal constituencies and collaborating internally to improve efficiency and to take advantage of scarce resources, perhaps. Small organizations are looking at collaborating outside of the organization, much more of a loose network of partners and suppliers, et cetera. Big data resonates much more so with the largest of organizations. And big data, by the way, might not mean NoSQL. It might just be really large relational databases, which we know clearly is the case in very large organizations. They have them. They use them. They've been there for a while. And then things like CEP, complex event processing, although it didn't resonate very strongly with any organization, it resonated more with larger organizations. So now I want to move to the next stage of the discussion and just talk about our vendor ratings. We did rate some 23 vendors. We try to expand it every year. We try to be super inclusive and, in every way imaginable. We try to include lots of users responding. We also try to rank as many vendors as we can. And the threshold that we set is just that they have to have a certain number of bona fide customers that can report in objectively about those products and services. That's it. If they get a number or enough customers willing to fill out a survey and report into us and be verified, then they get ranked. It's as simple as that. And we use this 33-measure system for evaluating vendors, and this sort of gives you all 33 of those measures and where they're positioned, because I'm going to show you the spider chart for Pentaho in just a moment so you can sort of get a sense of what it means. So we look at the sales and the acquisition experience, and there are 8 criteria for that. Next, we take a look at value for price paid. We take a look at the quality and the usefulness of the product. We take a look at the quality of the technical support, quality and value of consulting services, integrity, in other words, whether or not the vendor conducts themselves honestly, and then whether or not they would recommend the vendor. So those are all 33 of them, and their positions on the clock. And now I'm going to share with you Pentaho's. And Pentaho did very well this year. Significant improvement over the previous year. So you can see it starts at 12 o'clock. There are your sales and product acquisition measures. Value is at that 3 o'clock position, and then it turns to technology. Technology goes around going clockwise all the way around to about 7 o'clock. And then we have technical support, and then we have consulting, and then we have integrity and the recommended score. And so let me just share with you a couple of bullets here. So for Pentaho, they actually moved. So there are 5 market segments that we look at, and they had been in the quote-unquote emerging segment, and they moved into a much more elite segment this year called the high growth segment for 2013. And they also increased their performance across every measure compared to last year, so they made some great strides year over year. They were also what we call best in class, so in other words, that they were at the top of the heap across all of their peers for some of the key sales metrics, especially follow-up after the sale. That's one of the areas where a lot of the vendors and the industry fall short. On the product side, integration with third-party technologies is pretty impressive. That's where most of the vendors also fall down, their integration with third-party technologies. And then they were also best in class for tech support, and these are 2 of the measures. Tech support is a real challenge, by the way, for most vendors. But here, continuity of personnel is really critical. And then the number one issue with tech support across the entire industry, time to resolve problems, and here Pentaho did quite well. They were best in class. And then also continuity of personnel and value for their consulting organization. So they really did an exceptional job with their performance this year, so we congratulate them. So on that note, we're going to go into the Q&A session. I'd like to turn things back over to our host for that part of the program.
I just wanted to thank Howard for that excellent walkthrough of the Wisdom of Crowds results. And we only have a few questions on the line so far, so I do encourage those of you listening in to please do go ahead and submit some questions to us on the chat window. But while we wait for that to happen, Howard, let me address these few questions to you. First of all, question number one is, why are user penetration rates for BI so low even after so many years of focus on business intelligence for companies?
Well, that's a really good question. And, like I said, way back in the day, right, I think it was 93, while I was at Gartner, I talked about this notion of information democracy. And we were really optimistic back then, and maybe idealistic is the right term. And we thought that penetration rates would just skyrocket because it's just obvious the value here. There are a lot of reasons. Most notably, I think it's a cultural one. Educating people, most certainly senior management, to understand the importance and the value. And it has been changing, and largely because it sort of reminds me of, well, now I'm going to show how old I am, right? But when the PC first came out, and all of a sudden you found PCs, the PCAT, those of you that are old like me, you would see it showing up in the senior manager's office. And it would be on a nice little table in the corner, and it would have the C prompt burned into the screen because it was never really used very much. But they had it in the corner because it was kind of like a status symbol. Well, over time, as you had some degree of generational change, as new business school graduates came to the fore and rose to the higher ranks within the organization, they used computers. The same thing is true with mobile. The same thing is true with all technology. And we're finding this with things like business intelligence, where you're seeing younger executives climbing the ranks, having been educated in business school in the use of data, analyzing and visualizing and making decisions based on facts. So it's slowly but surely changing, but it's a cultural issue more than anything else within organizations. And even existing organizations, I've seen some make a transformation, and there are multiple things that really need to be in place. And actually, that was the subject of my last book, Profiles in Performance, where we talked about this notion of what I call a performance-directed culture. And an organization really needs to have visionary leadership to really achieve it, because they're the ones that really determine things like the strategy of the organization, the alignment with the strategy of the organization, and transparency and accountability. To really achieve strategic business intelligence, you kind of have to be both transparent and accountable within the organization. And most organizations, or most people in organizations, love the idea of transparency. It means that you should be transparent, but I'm going to be opaque. And they love accountability, too. Everybody else should be accountable except for them. And I think it was, who wrote Naked Corporation? Don Tapscott basically talked about transparency in that book, and said basically to succeed with transparency, everyone has to be transparent, or naked, using his nomenclature. So it ends up being more of a cultural issue than a technological one, and that's why organizations struggle with it. Technology is really the easy bit, going out and buying a tool and implementing a tool. Getting adoption and getting use out of it and incorporating it into one's ongoing activities and the way they approach their work life is substantially more difficult.
Well, great. Thanks for that, Howard. So we did have another question come in as well. One of our attendees has asked, in your vendor rankings for the Wisdom of Crowds survey, do all the categories carry the same weight in determining the final score?
That's a great question. The answer is no, they don't. There are some that have a higher weight. So, for instance, the value for price paid stands by itself as a dimension, whereas all of the sales and acquisition ones get averaged. The product ones get averaged. Consulting and tech support also get averaged. So consulting and tech support are each 5. Product, there's 12. Sales, there's 8. So value stands by itself. Integrity stands by itself. And the recommend score stands by itself because we think that those are very important. So that's a great question. So 3 of them stand by themselves, and the other categories get averaged.
Great. And another question, do you have any metrics on the growth of the number of companies adopting BI year after year? This could be a large factor affecting adoption and projected adoption numbers. So do you have a sense of the growth?
Well, we do. I mean, we have a sense. Of course, we'll know much more next year because this is the first year that we asked about penetration on an enterprise level. So the data that we have previously was more tool-oriented and didn't give us a complete picture. We have more of a complete picture of current penetration. We have a picture of where they think they want to be. So we can try to project, and we did project certainly within today's presentation, also within the document. But we won't really know until next year. Anything that I would share share with you today around growth would be really anecdotal in my opinion. So I know that we've seen growth. The market is substantially larger. Has it doubled in the last 5 years? Possibly. But once again, that's more of a black art too, right? How do you measure growth? I know that, most of the large analyst organizations do it based on revenue. And we're not going to try and do it based on revenue. We're going to try and do it based on numbers of users that have been automated with business intelligence. So short answer is next year, we're going to know a lot more.
And I think that's wonderful that you're focusing on the number of users because, with the change from proprietary licensing models to subscription-oriented models with more of the open source movement, revenue becomes such a imperfect way of looking at the growth of BI. So I think it really is, it does lie in the number of users actually using business intelligence. So that's terrific, and we'll look forward to hearing much more about that next year. And then a final question that's come in that I think will be a fun one to wrap up on. With all the attention out there around big data, you see it everywhere in trade press, you see it in everything you talk about with software technology today. Why is there such a drop of interest or a perceived drop of interest coming through in your survey reports?
Also a great question. I think that, there are some great use cases out there for big data. I actually did a case study with Ancestry.com. I think it was early this year or late last year. And they're doing some really cool things. And they have lots of PhDs that are using Hadoop to create algorithms and crawl through the data and infer relationships. But I think that there's a lot of confusion around what big data is. In most cases, big data, and the reason it resonates in our study with the largest of organizations is that it's just traditional structured content and relational databases, but just lots of it. They may be dealing with petabytes or even exabytes in some cases, and they've been doing it for many, many years in some sort of an appliance like a Teradata or an Oracle database. And so if you mean that, then they're already doing it. That's not new. But big data could also mean NoSQL. It can mean Hadoop and HBase and things like that. It could also mean social media data and social media analysis. And so when we say big data, whenever I have a discussion with somebody, I have to then start asking some questions to understand specifically what aspect of quote-unquote big data that they mean. And when you have to start breaking out, 3 or 5 or however many V's to explain it, you have some confusion in the marketplace. So I think that that's some of it, but also most organizations, I think, are just really focused on low-hanging fruit. And low-hanging fruit, is typically not in the petabytes of data, and it's not unstructured content. Typically, it's internal corporate data, which is stored in relational databases, which may actually only be in the gigabytes in terms of size. It may not be, even, terabytes or petabytes. So I think there's still a lot of that low-hanging fruit that's available, and that seems to be what most organizations, not all of them, are focused on, even though there are some really interesting and a growing number of use cases for quote-unquote big data.
Yes, agreed. And I think part of the problem is that as an industry, we don't distinguish very well with this term big data between what we're calling traditional, very large-scale databases that are relationally structured versus all of this new flurry around unstructured activity and semi-structured data that we can now capture with new technologies such as you've mentioned.
Right.
So I
and
do
in fact,
think,
there's probably an opportunity for us to add some additional questions next year in our survey instrument to try and clarify what people mean when they say big data.
I think that'd be an excellent addition to the survey. I agree. Well, I do believe that's the end of our questions for today. I don't see anything else coming in over the chat window, so I think we're going to go ahead and wrap things up at this point. But I want to thank Howard for the fantastic research itself, as well as the wonderful summary he's given here of the results of the findings. I want to thank everyone who's attended today and remind everyone that you will be receiving an email after this session that will include links to the presentation that we've shown today, as well as to the recording of this session itself. You can also go to the Pentaho website to get a full copy of the Wisdom of Crowds survey report. So we hope you will take advantage of that opportunity and take a look at the research in depth. Thank you again so much for joining us today, and I wish everyone a terrific rest of the day. Take care.